So let's move on to the JOptionPane. And JOptionPane is going to allow us to do the exact same thing, only in dialog boxes. So we'll be using dialog boxes instead of the just a regular scanner class or print statements. So using the JOptionPane class to prompt, read, and store user input, what we're dealing with here. Here's the steps that we go through. First of all, you have to have an import statement in order to use the JOptionPane class, which we have already done. So this is actually nothing new. So this, of course, goes above the class header, import jvax.swing. There's a space between the T and the J. JOptionPane, and so that goes above the class header, and again, that's something we have done before. We are going to declare a variable where the input will be stored, just like we did with the scanner class. You still have to have a place to store the user input, so that does not change. So here's an example. We've declared a variable whose name is name, and it's a string, and then we are going to prompt the user and read and store the user input, only this time we're going to do it instead of in 2 lines of code, we're going to do 1 line of code. So before we used a prompt statement, which was a print statement, and then we use another statement for scan.next, but this time we're going to do it all in 1 line. So what we're going to do is we're going to have the name of the variable is assigned JOptionPane.show input dialog. Now if you remember before, we did show message. So it's very important that you distinguish between the show input dialog and the show message dialog. And show input is for getting input, of course, from the user. And so everything else is the same about it as the show message. The only thing different is you have a variable that you're going to store input at the beginning, and you have the word input here instead of the word message. And then you can call the user or for the user input in the variable by using the show message, which we've already done. Now you notice here there is no variable to be assigned anything, so because that's not what we're doing. We are simply giving a message, and in this message we're going to call the variable. In this case, right here, we're going to call name and ask, well, what is your value? And that's going to be, the value is going to be what happened in here when the user entered his name. Alright, so that's basically how it goes. And so let's take a look at the next thing. The important JOptionPane note, and that is that the show input dialog method always returns a string. So we call that a method because it has parentheses following it. The show input dialog always returns a string. Alright, so that means that you must store the result of the show input dialog method in a string variable. You cannot store the input of the user in an int or a double unless you convert the result first. Okay, so you must store the result in a variable whose data type is a string unless you convert the result first, and that is something that we are going to learn later. So let's take a look at an example of how this works. Okay, so here's an example of a program being run using the JOptionPane dialog box. And so here we have the import statement, and then here is the variable is going to hold the name of a person. And so when the compiler reaches this line, of course, over here in the computer memory, it stores a cell, has a cell that has a memory location that has the name, first name. And so what happens as we run it here, let's compile it first and then run it. And so you notice that the dialog box waits here until right in the dialog box is where the user can type his name. So if he types his name there, now what's going to happen is when the user clicks on OK, that the word Frank is read by this code, by the show input dialog method. It actually reads the name, and then it also stores it in this variable right here. And so over here, what it'll do, it'll actually right after the user clicks on OK, it'll put Frank in the computer memory in this in the first name memory location. And then the next thing that's going to happen here is that a show message dialog box is going to show up, and that's going to call first name. As you see right here, it's going to actually call it and say, come over here and call this guy and say, what's your value, and it'll say Frank. So here we go, and it says hello Frank. There it goes, hello and Frank. So the important thing you notice here, input, you use the input dialog to not get input, but just to give a print statement or display something on the screen, is show message. That's the only difference between these two lines, except for the fact that the input line has to have a variable that is going to be assigned the return or the result of this input dialog.